It was a cold and dreary afternoon at the local grocery store. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a dull glow over the rows of produce, where an older woman, her coat frayed at the edges, hurriedly filled a small basket with essentials. At the checkout line, she nervously glanced at the total, too high for her to afford. Her hands trembled slightly as she dug into her wallet, pulling out a few crumpled bills. She looked at the cashier, her face pale, and then turned back to her basket, the weight of her reality sinking in. Behind her, a man in a well-worn jacket, his features hard to read, watched the scene unfold. His own life had been a series of quiet struggles, and he recognized the fear in her eyes, the fear of not being able to provide. Without a word, he stepped forward, and before the woman could react, he paid for her groceries. She turned, eyes wide with disbelief. Why would you? Her voice cracked with emotion. What happened next would change both of their lives forever, in a way neither could have anticipated. Meet Lucy, a single mother doing everything she can to make ends meet. She never asked for much in life, only enough to keep a roof over her head and food on the table for her 2 children. Her ex-husband had walked out when their son, Max, was only a baby. Since then, Lucy had worked 2, sometimes 3, jobs just to stay afloat. She never let her children feel the weight of the struggles she faced. No matter how tired she was, she always smiled, pretending everything was fine. But now, things had gotten harder. Max was growing up fast, and his needs were increasing. Lucy had taken on a new job at a small cafe after her hours at the grocery store, but it still wasn't enough to cover everything. Every month, she found herself stretching every dollar, choosing between bills, food, and sometimes the medicine she needed for herself. That day, she had gone to the store to buy a few things for dinner, some vegetables, bread, and milk. Simple things. But when she got to the counter, the total was more than she had expected. She had always felt the shame of not having enough, but today it hit harder. The embarrassment of holding up the line, the judgmental stares from the customers behind her, was more than she could bear. But Lucy wasn't one to give up. She had fought too hard to get this far. She would find a way to make it work, even if it meant sacrificing a little more. She tried to smile, hoping it would cover up the anxiety gnawing at her insides. The moment seemed to drag on as Lucy's fingers fumbled through her purse, desperate to find enough change to cover the remaining balance. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she tried to suppress the sting of embarrassment that was creeping up on her. She felt the eyes of the customers behind her boring into her. A quiet voice in her head whispered that she wasn't good enough. Maybe she should have bought less. Maybe she should have been more careful with her money. But it was too late now. Her hands were shaking as she came up with a few more crumpled bills. The cashier, a young girl with tired eyes, gave her a sympathetic look, but Lucy couldn't meet her gaze. She turned toward the man behind her in line, expecting nothing more than the usual disinterest or impatience from a stranger. But instead, he stepped forward. His voice was low, almost gruff, but there was a kindness in it. "I'll cover the rest," he said, his eyes meeting hers. Lucy blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What? No, I couldn't possibly," she stammered, shaking her head. But the man was already swiping his card. The transaction was done before she could protest any further. The cashier handed him the receipt, and the man turned to Lucy. "Don't worry about it. It's nothing," he said, offering her a small, kind smile. Lucy stood there, frozen. She had no words to express the flood of emotions coursing through her. She wanted to cry, but she didn't know how to say thank you. She felt her chest tighten, a mixture of gratitude and shame. Who was this man, and why had he done this? What kind of person would go out of their way for a stranger, especially one like her? As the man turned to leave, Lucy's voice finally broke through. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you help me?" He paused for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "Because everyone deserves a little help now and then," he said quietly, before walking out of the store. The man's words echoed in Lucy's mind as she left the store. The groceries now paid for, but her thoughts scattered. She looked at her receipt, unable to fully process what had just happened. What kind of person was he? Why had he chosen her? The world seemed so vast, so impersonal sometimes, but here was a stranger taking a moment to show kindness. Her mind raced as she walked home, the chilly wind biting at her skin. She had to know more about him. She had to understand what drove him to do something so unexpected. Maybe he was just one of those rare, good people who genuinely cared about others. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man's story. There had to be. The next day, as Lucy walked past the same grocery store, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance. It was a man, his back turned, staring out at the street, lost in thought. She hesitated for a moment, but something inside urged her to approach him. She walked up cautiously, and when he turned to face her, she didn't know what to say at first. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she started, her voice still shaky. "I don't know what to say. No one's ever done something like that for me before." The man smiled faintly but didn't say anything. He simply watched her, his eyes soft. After a beat, he spoke. "I know what it's like to feel like you're invisible, to feel like no one notices, like you don't matter." His voice was quieter now, as if the words carried weight from personal experience. I don't want anyone to feel like that." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was reeling. She looked at the man in a new light. This wasn't just an act of kindness. It was something deeper. There was a shared pain in his eyes, something that connected them both, even though they were strangers. He looked at her again, his expression softening. "I lost everything once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I vowed that I would never let anyone else feel as alone as I did." Lucy felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't expected this shared understanding between them. He wasn't just helping her because he could. He understood her struggle. He had been there too. And in that moment, everything changed for both of them. Lucy's eyes filled with tears as she realized that the man, the stranger, wasn't just helping her out of generosity. He was reaching out to her in a way that only someone who had known hardship could. His vulnerability, his openness, was a rare gift. In his eyes, she saw not pity but compassion. It was as though he had seen through her fears, her exhaustion, and understood her in a way no one ever had. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me." The man smiled faintly again, his eyes glimmering with a quiet sadness. "I think I do," he replied softly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. As Lucy stood there, still holding her grocery bags, she felt something shift within her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. She felt seen, understood, and most of all, grateful. The days that followed were filled with new hope. Lucy didn't know if she would ever see the man again, but his words stayed with her. She realized that she didn't have to face everything alone. And it wasn't just the man's generosity that made the difference. It was his acknowledgement of her humanity, her struggle, and her worth. With renewed energy, Lucy found ways to make things better for her children. She started to believe again that good things could happen, even in the hardest of times. Max, her son, noticed the change in her. He smiled more, laughed more, and her heart swelled with love for him. They were a team, and together, they would get through anything. One evening, as she sat down to a modest dinner with her children, Lucy smiled to herself. She might not have everything, but she had enough. And that was all that mattered. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and life-changing stories. In a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming, it's the small acts of kindness and compassion that remind us of our shared humanity. Let's spread love one story at a time. Share this video with someone who might need a little hope today. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next inspiring story.